We're joined now by Jake Traylor, MS Now White House reporter, and Hunter Woodall, MS Now political reporter. Guys, thanks for coming to the table this morning.
Of course.
Jake, I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on what is the strategy and what is being communicated to Trump to stay out on the campaign trail at this point, with his favorability ratings at an all-time low and him enmeshed in so many global and domestic crises that are not going his way.
Yeah, I mean, it's this duality, right, of we do know if the president is on the ballot or is there the base is mobilized, but that doesn't necessarily translate to a lot of these moderate voters. In fact, it often shows that it does more worse than good for those individuals. The thing here, though, and we've talked about this a lot, but the president himself does not care about these midterms in the way that he previously has before. If we compare 2018, him on the trail versus right now, we are seeing the president way less enthused himself to be out on the campaign trail. Because he doesn't care about it.
Well, why doesn't he care about it?
This time around, he is more concerned with things like Iran, with things like his legacy, with some of his projects. He has less of a focus and desire to. I mean, we heard the quote from him himself. He said the quiet part out loud when he said, "I've already won my race. These people need to win their races now." That's been the MO for the president this time around. What we're not necessarily seeing are people really try and change his mind. We know that he's got these loyalists around him. If anything, they're playing to his best intentions and letting him focus on what he wants to focus on, and then doing the best they can on the other side to just get the candidates mobilized to talk about Democrats, how they're not doing their jobs well. But there's not a lot right now inside the White House of people convincing the president to go out on the campaign trail in some of the battleground states. And we're seeing that reflected. We're seeing the president go to South Carolina in a deep Republican state and not go to some places like Georgia or North Carolina. We know that he was actually initially scheduled to go to North Carolina last week and instead decided to go to South Carolina instead to go for Darlene. So it's just the president, honestly, at this point, doing what he wants to do, and there's not too many people inside trying to change his mind.
There's that story that Susie Wiles told the folks in the White House, you guys focus on affordability, the president's going to do what he wants to do. That only works if you have a president who doesn't have as big of a megaphone as Donald Trump, because he's drowning out everyone else.
Story, by the way, authored by Jake Traylor.
There we go. Yes, it was.
I heard that report was good.
It was all right. The reporter. I want to play some sound from the guy with the biggest megaphone, also at Joint Base Andrews. This is him, I think, on his way to Darlene Graham. Let's listen to this.
She was being honest. I mean, she's into the price of groceries, the price of food, the price of beef, and it hasn't been her thing.
So he's talking about the gaffe at the debate where she didn't seem to know what was going on with Taiwan. We don't have to get into that. I don't think we need to, because that's pretty clearly she didn't get into it. So why should we?
It's not her thing.
But him even saying she's into the price of groceries, the price of food, the price of beef. So you should also be into those things. It seemed like when he talks about them, and this has been true, but we're getting into the time where people are going to start really paying attention. Hunter, it seems like he says it as if these are sideshows, like the price of beef is a sideshow, the price of food is a sideshow, the price of groceries are sideshows and not the main reason why people are voting or not voting in November.
Well, let's think about what Jake just said about kind of that focus, right, or the lack thereof from the president. The House Democrats, they are well positioned to potentially flip that chamber, right? Senate, a little bit more difficult, but there's momentum going that direction too. Democrats win the House, the final 2 years of the Trump presidency get difficult. Democrats win the House and Senate, that gets incredibly difficult, if not outright challenging for Trump. The legacy, how do you pass things? And really, there'll be investigations. There's going to be that threat of, you already have some fringe House Democrats talking impeachment stuff. Really could be a miserable final 2 years of the Trump presidency. So you think with all that going on, there would be a little bit more of a focus on, okay, how do you try and galvanize Republican voters out? But we're just not quite seeing that so far, because obviously, think back to 2018, first Trump term, right? This was such a weird mixed bag. Democrats flipped the House, but Republicans, they picked up Senate seats and all that. It's such a weird dynamic right now, and it seems like Republicans can't quite figure out what's the message. Do they run towards Trump because he still has so much primary sway, even though he has candidates losing that he's endorsed, or do they try and kind of push back slightly? And there's no set formula right now.
Which is not mentioned, because if I recall, in Byron Donalds' victory speech in Florida, he didn't mention Trump. He talked about grocery prices, he talked about prices, but he, who is someone who's a real Trump ally, did not mention the president in his speech, if I remember correctly.
I'm gonna not even take that bait because that's my new hobby horse, Byron Donalds.
I would never.
Governor of Florida,
I would never bait
the
you.
Republican nominee. Can we just play? The vice president was also out on the campaign trail yesterday. The president was in South Carolina, and the vice president was in Ohio yesterday at the steel plant. Just, ladies and gentlemen, just listen very carefully to the words of the Vice President of the United States.
This November, you and I and our fellow citizens, we're going to go to the ballot box and we're going to face a choice. Do we believe in the United States of America? Do we believe in the hardworking men and women who built this great nation? Do we demand that our government serve us and our children rather than fraudsters and criminals? Do we demand that the American president fight for the American people first?
I wanted to play that because I'm just worried. Does he not hear the words that are coming out of his mouth? Is there no sense of self-awareness, Jake? I mean, if this were a normal administration, what the vice president just said there would be great words to hear. Those are all true. And if I remember right, this is him talking about, it's part of a piece where he's talking about his family. And I think it was his grandfather. But, these are, do we demand that our government serve us and our children rather than fraudsters and criminals? Yes. So does he think this message is going to work, especially when people are so angry?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big thing here, which is that there are Republican strategists who have conceded that right now the White House and Republicans do not have a lot to run on. So a lot of the lines like this fall really dry, fall hypocritical. And what actually is the interesting part of this, I don't think it's surprising anymore to hear Vance say something like that, given what we've seen over the past year. It is still sometimes shocking, but I think we're used to it. What is really interesting is the way that behind closed doors right now, there are Republican strategists telling candidates in the House and the Senate it is okay to distance yourself from Trump and Vance right now, localize this election, point to how Democrats are way worse than you are. That's interesting because, again, back to 2018, if we go there was this get as close to Trump as you can. He's going to be your ticket to success. We're not seeing Republicans play that game anymore. You just talked about Donalds, and that is because this is, we look at all polling on the economy, on inflation, on approval of the war. Underwater for Vance and Trump right now. And so we're seeing Republicans do their best to respond to that.
Trump's at 33%, the lowest of his presidency, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll nationally at this point.
He's been there for a while.
Mm-hmm. He lives there. It's his new home.
It's like SpongeBob.
Jackie.
Save us.
Hunter, I'm wondering, just because you are so deep in the numbers and a student of everything going on now, what's your eye currently on?
So let's think about, that clip that you played from J.D. Vance, from Vice President Vance in Ohio. Ohio's that state, right, where really Republicans have, built so much strength there. Yeah. That should be one where they feel pretty comfortable.
It's sort of similar to Florida in some ways. Lost its swing state status and was the rise of Trumpism.
It's just gotten redder. It's one of those things where it was that presidential battleground, just like Florida, and it's really not that much anymore. So this should have been a Senate race, where they felt more comfortable. But when I've talked to Republicans in Ohio over the last few months, there's been that panic of Sherrod Brown, that former senator now running again in this election. They're worried about losing to him. There's that active fear, and that is one of those seats. I mean, I talk about how the Senate is a difficult, still a difficult hurdle for Democrats to flip. Winning Ohio, that really would set them up to potentially flip that chamber. They have to win in these redder places, Ohio, Alaska, to really make that, more in play. And if that happens, that really sends a message of, maybe we're seeing a slight decline of Trumpism that we haven't seen in past years.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because we were talking about this at the top of the show. Ohio is one of the places where outside Republican groups are actually not being quiet on the issue of rising costs and energy prices, with them sort of making the defense or the response that, yes, things are bad, but Sherrod Brown is just going to make things worse with his policy, and Husted will find a solution to these rising costs that you're facing. And it's sort of interesting that he's decided not to just let it lie the way the rest of a lot of Republicans running right now are.
Also, while you have the president calling affordability a hoax, right? So it's like you can't talk out of both sides of your mouth as a party. People have to hear at least something.
They're doing a good job.
Are they doing a good job? The numbers are bad.
Well, I mean, they're doing it.
I want to show some new polling. This is Emerson College, really quickly, Jake. Hypothetical 2028 matchups. I know, folks, we're talking about the midterms. We're political reporters up here. So this is matchups between Rubio versus Vance versus all these other people, right? So there's Newsom, Harris, and Ocasio-Cortez. Nobody has, of course, said they are running. The thing that's interesting is Rubio outperforms Vance. And I think if you watch what we just saw with Vance, you understand why. Rubio and his wife were on the Katie Miller podcast, and say what you want about his politics, the kind of do I want to have a beer with him test, right? That folks still kind of use. You seem like you want to have a beer with Marco Rubio, maybe not J.D. Vance. I'm curious what you're hearing, because last time I think you two reported that Trump was more on the J.D. Vance side. But is the rest of the party and the MAGA faithful on the same train?
Yeah,
they're still waiting it out.
That's a great question. I'm sure Jackie can speak to this too. What's interesting is I don't think, to your thing about the test of can I have a beer with them, I think that does still matter significantly to moderates, to voters across the country. That is not the metric Donald Trump uses for who he picks. There's way different metrics. And so what the party's doing versus what Trump is doing is different. We reported that the president's back kind of into the Vance of it all at the moment. Not anti-Rubio, just into the Vance of it. I do think right now what is always important to watch is watch where the money goes. And I know it's too early right now, but there have been, and we're still reporting this out before we have enough to really, really stand on, but there have been multiple donors with big pocketbooks that have said things along the lines of, we're kind of waiting for Rubio, where we need Rubio to step up and say he actually wants it. A big question there, due to a lot of reporting. It sounds like Rubio may not step up if Vance says he wants it first. That's going to be the more question. Does Rubio want it? I think there are many people waiting in the gallows for Rubio to jump in, because exactly like you said, we see him on a lot of these clips online and people go, I may not agree with them, but this is something that Vance doesn't have, which is a likability of sorts.
Right. And let's not forget, Rubio is Secretary of State. So to run, he would have to resign that post. You think Hillary Clinton, when she left in 2013, so she could run in 2016.